and got tremendous feedback from the team of things that seem obvious now that I had left off, like show where the patch came from. You know, what city and town and region was it in? What location is it? A lot of very good feedback, and that was a huge help to me putting the document together. Now, all through the process, I get feedback from some really qualified collectors, but this is where it started, and I think we're talking about pretty close to a year ago, because I originally planned to publish this in March of 2023. And as you'll see here in a moment, that wasn't successful, but that was the original plan. So hooray to you guys online. I also would like to recognize that there are some people, some real patch trading gold in the presentation tonight that I see. I'm probably not going to tell you anything new. Certainly Albertus falls in that category. You are a hero to all of us, and your document was equally as important to our hobby as was Dwight Michel's. So thank you for being here. This first slide it's a parody on the book I put together instead of a complete guide on collecting Wabaningo issues. This is an incomplete guide on publishing a book. I've never published a book before. I'm an engineer. I'm not particularly good at English grammar, but I had some help, which I'll discuss here in a moment. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. How it got started, what made me want to do this, who I got help from along the way, and what sort of stuff is in the book, and what are some of the pretty interesting things that I learned along the way. And you hear me say this several times tonight. I really thought I was an expert on Wabaningo issues when I started this process, and boy was I wrong. Okay, let's go to the next one. So I have to pay homage to the original author, Dwight Michel. As difficult as it was for me to put this book together, it pales in comparison to what this young man put together in 1951 and published in 52. His book has not only information on the lodge meanings, which most lodges didn't know what their Indian name even meant. He dug up where they were from, what region they were in, what did the patch look like. He gave a numerical designation, an alphabetical designation in the back. He talked about patches that had already been succeeded by other patches. He talked about totems. It was an extraordinary work. And folks like Dwight and Albertus, we owe a tremendous debt of that attitude to. So as this says, around 2021, I had been collecting data for, I'd say, a few decades relative to the WAB book whenever I learned something new. Some either an experienced collector or I saw a patch that was identified as a WAB issue, but it didn't look exactly right to me, but maybe I bought it or traded for anyway. And I started this big volume, a cigar box full of WAB issues. And then as I began to read more and more about the book, I saw some inconsistencies and started to dig a little bit deeper. But the goal, and this is in the presentation multiple times too, when I actually decided to make the decision to put a book together, the goal was always to help those folks, new and advanced collectors, become a believer in the Wabaningo book. You know, help them become a collector. It is a wonderful collection to put together because it's not an infinite number of issues. There's only 117 or 20 issues, and it represents a very important part of the history of the Order of the Arrow. So that's it. The goal of this whole thing was to promote the Wabaningo issue collecting against folks like you and novice collectors. So having never written a book, I thought this would be pretty easy. You know, I've got all this decades of data that I've collected, a lot of it in notes, but a lot of it in Microsoft Word. I'll just put this together, get a little help, and with today's modern publishing techniques, a couple weeks out, I'll have a book. Yeah, it didn't really happen that way. So what the next presentation talks about, some interesting subtleties that I discovered on issues in the book, none of which I was aware of when we started. And then the end of the presentation talks about, here are kind of cover designs I had to go through and some of the issues that I learned about publishing a book over the past year. Okay, let's get started. So here's what the original book looks like. And I know there are no rookie collectors listening tonight, but if you look at, in fact, can you blow up that image, Larry? Can you increase the size of the book itself? If you look and see there's the arrow running left to right, there's a white highlight on it that runs the length of the arrow. If you have a real book, that's probably, you'll see that white shadow going all the way up the shaft. The real books also have the red in the bottom right-hand corner, that whatever it is, that lake or the shrub or whatever, there's a little bit of red in there. That's also only in the real book. And there's some black and white books that are obviously not, but if you're not sure, because there are some color versions of this that are reprints. By the way, I spoke to multiple people that know there's no one in the family that authorized anyone to generate another copy of this book. But if you open a real book and look at it compared to one of the reprints, the paper is also a little bit shiny. I mean, when you're holding one next to the other, it's obvious. A little bit quality paper is a little bit better. But now you know how to at least tell the difference in the books. So what's in that book is 177 OA images, 13 region emblems, some drawings, some superseded emblems, some totems, and a list of lodges without emblems, and lodge locations, totems, identification keys, certainly a landmark decision. Let me also point out, because I don't think I've talked about it in the presentation, there's 13 region emblems there. Now, most of you guys look like you're in my generation, and that means nobody, I didn't know anybody who knew anybody that had a region emblem when I was a kid. By the way, I just noticed Dave Minahan in here, also a gentleman who has given a tremendous amount to this hobby, including multiple publications, and he was of great help to me in this book. I'm sorry I didn't see you on, Dave, earlier. So the region emblems, is, you remember we were kids, I might have seen one on a professional scouter's uniform, but you couldn't trade for them. They were not for trade. And here's the first time that I know of Dwight put together one of each region emblem, and it's prominently displayed in the first few pages of the book. So that shows you how things have changed, where when we were kids, they're impossible, and now they seem to be pretty routinely available. So we call these WAB emblems. That's not new to you guys. I did want to point out that in the book, all the region emblems that were in the 52 version, I had Paul Myers go and help me identify exactly which issue it was, because he's certainly the expert in that area and I'm not. But I felt pretty comfortable about identifying the WAB issues. Something else that's different about this is I'm a huge believer in first flaps in color, which I'd collected first flaps for 30 or 40 years also. And one of the things I really liked in their book was they gave a 1 to 10 rating, and they gave me a breakdown on what the rating actually meant. And I totally plagiarized and borrowed that idea. I went with a 1 to 100 rating system because there are some flaps, in my opinion, that were 10s that didn't belong to be 10s for me, but they didn't have a 10.1 or 10.2. I probably had half a dozen 359 F1s in my life, but with things like 526, you're lucky to get one in your life. So I went 1 to 100, and there's my breakdown of what that means. Okay, let's go on. We got a lot of ground to cover. So main contributors, certainly Larry Lane, because he did silly enough to volunteer to proofread, and I sent him multiple copies of this where he looked at what I had generated. He must have some sort of an English background, because when I use a colon and a semicolon and what's underlined and what's italics was pretty much foreign to me. And he was a great help there. You can see Dave Minahan also there. You'll probably recognize most people on that list, and I can guarantee you that this book would be a shell of itself without input from those folks. Okay, let's go on. Interesting, cool stuff I learned. Okay, let's look at the pictures. These guys are patch collectors. Let's look at pictures. So we've all probably had, each page I show, if it's grayed out, it's interesting, but not as interesting as I want to point out, but it's in the book. If you have a question about anything that's on a page, I'll be glad to help answer it. but those that I've highlighted were a surprise to me putting the book together. This patch from Lodge 7, it's a pretty large patch, 100 millimeters, about 5 inches or so. I probably had 4 or 5 in my box that I'd collected over the years as a WAB issue. And when I really started digging into it for this book, none of them was the right issue. And it's somewhat hard to tell, but that little picture to the right shows a hand, R4 and R5, the entire hand is stitched around the perimeter. Those are pretty easy to find, but to find one that there is no stitching, that's a difficult patch. And so that was a big surprise to me, is everything in my box from Lodge 7 was wrong, and I had to go out specifically and search down that issue. All right, let's keep going. Interesting story. I talked to a gentleman from Lodge 12. It's not a particularly difficult patch to find, but I asked him, you know, you have an X3, which is a cut edge, and yet the Wabaningo book says it's a rolled edge, and I routinely would blow up the image from the WAB handbook and look at it. It's certainly a rolled edge, and I thought, is your numbering system wrong? Is X3 really X2? And he says, no. The Lodge paid extra money to have the rolled edge on X2, and they wanted to save money for X3, so they went to a cut edge. I don't know how much money you save, but that's the story I got from a Lodge member. 41. I'm sure I've had 10 of these in my lifetime, but again, everything in my box was wrong. That's a whippoorwill, and if you look at the detail on the bottom right, it has a little ring around its neck. Can everyone see that? Is this big enough to see that sort of stuff? Okay, so that little whippoorwill and ring is the R2. So notice there's R1s out. So if we've numbered this thing correctly, there are issues that are older than that issue. And certainly everything in the handbook was photographed by Dwight in the 1950 to 51 time frame. So I don't know what was R1, but this piece is particularly difficult to find with that round ring. Without the ring, you've probably all had 6 or 8 of them. So I thought that was very interesting. Not a particularly expensive piece, but that ring makes it much more rare to find. Oh, let me point out also on this page, I didn't highlight it, but that 38 above there, if you look in the WAB handbook, it describes it as white twill. So for years, I looked for a design in white twill and probably accumulated 8 or 10 of those white twill versions, and none of them matched that. And then someone pointed out to me that, hey, this felt one looks a lot like the one in the WAB handbook. And it certainly is. So of all the thousands of things he got right in the WAB handbook, there were a few small errors, and that's one of them. I'm still a believer that 99.9% of what he put in the book was right on the money, and it's a great publication. All right, let's go to the next one. 47. Now, I saw a 47 round at the 81 NOAC, and I forget who showed it to me, but they were really proud of it, and I thought, well, it's just a round felt. But gosh, that's a hard patch to get. And I also learned during this book, there's 2 versions. There's one with kind of a maroon arrow and thinner lettering, and there's one with a redder arrow, which you kind of see in the bottom right. See the fletching is kind of a little darker red, and the lettering is a little bit bolder. Both extraordinary pieces. I don't know that I could say one is more difficult to find than the other, but by blowing the image up and overlaying one image of the WAB handbook with a known patch, it's definitely the one with the maroon arrow that matches the Wabaningo handbook exactly. Maroon arrow, pointed fletching. Great piece. 50. Somewhere from the southeast, Birmingham. We've all had a lot of those Lodge 50 rounds. Cut edge 50 round with arrow. Great patch. Very great design. But again, what was in my cigar box was wrong. If you blow the Wabaningo handbook picture up and look at it carefully, that beak of the, what kind of an animal is that? Whatever that bird is, that beak extends over the little orange breastplate by about 1 millimeter. So that's 40,000ths of an inch. But when you look at it and compare it with R2 and 3, it's definitely different. So the R1A and X1A are the ones that are displayed in the handbook. And again, that one with the beak extending over the little chest plate, far more difficult to find. And I don't know why. Just because it's in the handbook doesn't mean it should be more difficult. But maybe since it was R1A, they made less than they did R2s and R3s. I don't know. Wow, 55 leather. So this is probably one of the pieces with the most mystique and most misunderstanding in the whole book. I was fortunate enough to spend some time with a gentleman, I believe his name is Mike Wallace, and he had written a book about the local camp there. And when I told him what I was doing, he volunteered some terrific information and sent me some pictures of some boys going to Philmont in 1949, and they're clearly wearing that leather patch. Now, the sketch to the right is what's actually in the WAB book itself. It's just a hand-drawn little Thunderbird, and it's got a date at the bottom. We never really found one that looks just like that, but there are 3 varieties of this L2A, and I think I've got some on the next page to show you that, but there's lots of people out there and lots of designs. I've been shown at least 15 different versions of this 55L, but I believe the L2 is the one most likely to be what was represented in the WAB handbook. You can go on to ISCA and see there's others available, and I certainly have no proof that they're not the right issue, but I do have proof that that piece was worn in the 1949 timeframe by boys in that lodge. And so that's why I considered it for this book as the L2 ABC, as the real WAB issues. And if I think in the next page, Larry, do I show what those look like? Yeah, here you go. So L2A, you can see, has got no date. L2B has got 44 on it, and L2C has got 46. Those are my designations, by the way. I just made those up. Mr. Wallace also gave me a piece. This thing for the right is a lodge history from his own lodge. And it talks about, if you look in the third paragraph, the first patch of this lodge reported to be a round pocket patch of leather about 3 inches in diameter, issued up to World War II. So previous to 41, they supposedly had a round patch, but no one I know has ever turned one of these up. They do talk about, they said, and that was always known until the familiar orange and blue flap showed up, which I show a picture of, and the trading patch, that round patch, the trading patch. So they're mentioned in this document, but they also talk about a patch that, to my knowledge, was never issued. And something else that's odd about this patch, if you look around the second to last paragraph, for 2 years, the OA did not operate in this council, which should have been 45 and 46, because then in 47, the lodge reinstated its charter. But yet there's a patch there dated in the bottom left-hand corner, 1946. So 55 is still an anomaly to me, and I've done quite a lot of digging, but either this short lodge history is wrong, which is entirely possible, or I haven't dug enough. But right now, I believe those are 3 pieces that were most likely to be what was being represented in the WAB handbook. 113. So for years, I lived in Florida. I noticed David Weed on here. What in the world is that growing on your face, young man? So when I had to move from Florida to Texas in 2000, David Weed and I were in the same lodge in West Palm Beach. I moved here and I said, well, gee, there's a couple of WAB issues I should be able to get now that I'm moving to Texas. 327 out of Waco and 113 out of Houston. And again, I dug up 4 or 5 different things and put in my book so that I've got it. But if you look at that fletching in the bottom right-hand corner, it's directional. You see a shaft and you see fletching going up and fletching going down diagonally. The WAB handbook does not show that. The WAB handbook issue, if you blow it up, it has a single stitched fletching. And this piece was much harder to find than the others. Again, it's X1, so maybe they didn't make as many, but I'd say its value was somewhere, I don't know, 40 or 50 times what the X2 and X3s are worth. Close to that. No shaft in the fletching. So I was surprised, thought that'd be an easy piece to find. It was not. All right, let's keep going. There's some North Carolina boys on here. Not a killer patch, but no tags from the bow. There's several varieties of that. R1, A, B, C, and D. Only the C has no tags from the bow to any of the letters. So pre-1952, if you guys have your lettering right, R1A and R1B are older than the WAB issue. Again, me and my cigar box, I probably had 2 or 3. It's a pretty good patch. I didn't have a bunch of those, but I think I had an R1A and R1D, both of which I thought were the right WAB issue. And I think that for a vast majority of beginning collectors, they ought to go collect something that looks like it's in the WAB book. It doesn't have to be exactly. I had a great time doing that, but if you want to know the exact issue, that's kind of what this document is about. And 188, this is another North Carolina piece. Again, I had the wrong one in the cigar box. That little sash that's on the right shoulder of the Indian drops below his garment that he's wearing. Just a little bit. Everybody see that? That is the absolute key to determining what is the WAB issue. Another thing interesting about this is, remember that Dwight did this photography in the late 40s and early 50s, which is many years ago as far as camera technology. And even though he was well versed with filters and how to make things show up, if you look at that, the blues and the greens, even a nice color image, they're kind of hard to see. So with 1950s black and white technology, this stuff was impossible to see. So he took some sort of a white marker or indicator and he outlined a lot of features on this patch, which he did on multiple other patches. But I struggled at first trying to find one that looked like it because they don't exist. He did things, maybe 20% of the emblems in the book, he physically did things to make it easier for us to see the patch in his book. Remember, his book was only 5 by 7. And so each patch in the book was, inch in diameter. So, and in black and white, it was tough. So he spent the extra time to do some highlighting and make these things show up. As the note suggests, the shirt, the bonnet, and the stars were outlined by hand in the WAB book. So you won't find something that has the stitching that matches exactly what's in the WAB book, but you will find one that has that little sash holding over the right shoulder. All right, let's go. 242. Boy, I got another education on that one. I had heard that Lodge 272, which we'll talk about later, was special because the very first one didn't have the number, and Dwight Bichelle with lacing tape or something laid out the number for the picture he took. I kind of heard about that. This one is a surprise to me. This, because I'd looked for this piece for years with the long bird nose and the tail over the arrow. And I just never found it. So, I mean, I collected a couple of chenilles, which I thought they were chenilles, but nothing matched it. So this is known as chenille, and I even called it that here because that's what people know it as, but it's really white felt on blue felt. And it's fairly large, and they only made one. And the next page we'll get in to talk about that, but I was fortunate enough to get a picture of the actual emblem, and you can see in my rating 1 to 100, this is the top of the line. There are 2 pieces that are rated 100, and this is one of them. And I guess how can you not rate it 100? There's only one of them. So let's go to the next page, and I'll show you a little bit how we diagnose this. Bottom left is the 242C1, a terrific piece in its own point. An early 50s chenille, very difficult to find. To the right, you see a black and white picture. That's actually a high-resolution scan from an original WAB handbook. And if you take that, and that's actually what that is, that's about a 30% transparency from the WAB book. And if you could take that and drag it and set it on top of that patch, it matches exactly. 100% matches exactly. No other chenille from the Lodge matches. So that was an eye-opener, yet there's a second one-of-a-kind prototype in the WAB handbook for me. Remember, I told you I thought I was an expert when I started, but I clearly wasn't because I didn't know that existed. Lodge 419 had a pretty famous chenille, which we'll probably, I think we talk about here in a moment. But the story I heard was right around 1951, This lodge, located also in Pennsylvania, wanted a chenille of equal uh, reverence. So the LEC issued 12 of these around 1951. And you can tell it by the C's in the cloud. There's 3 C's in that cloud because they've issued, I don't know, half a dozen different chenilles. Don't know the story is true, but that's what I heard. And I've heard several people tell me that 12 is the number. So very interesting. Tells you what the back of the label is, where it was a chenille in the book. I took a picture of it and identified it by the standard pennant company's logos, and that's a Type 5 label, which was pre-1951. Interesting. All right, let's go on. Interesting to me, at least. Okay, we talked about the 242. Here's the one I kind of knew about, but I thought it was basically the exact same patch that Dwight had just put some lacing tape on to make 273. But the YF1, by the way, those little numbers by them, those are from the actual book where I know who sent me the picture of that. It's a credit to the person who supplied that. So you can ignore that little number. But the YF1 is exactly the piece that's in the WAB handbook. It has a brown dove and 272 added by hand. I really think it's lacing tape, the kind of stuff we laced stuff as a kid with. I think that's what that is. The real F1, which we know of today, is shown below. See, the lettering is red, and it's a gray dove. So very different pieces, and there's only one YF1. And the next page, I think, actually show a better copy of it. There it is. There's certificate of authenticity. That one is in Dwight's collection. You can see it's a brown dove, and you can see it's some sort of mechanically attached number. Great piece. This has tremendous lineage. I don't want to mention the names, but that piece has changed hands at least 3 or 4 times in the past couple of decades at $50,000 every time. So it's another 100 rated patch. 270. Okay, boy. Remember I told you that when I left David Weeda's Florida and moved to Texas, I was going to be able to pick up this piece out of Waco because it just has solid feathers. I mean, how hard can that be? White veins show through on A1, B, and C. That piece with no white veins showing through is an absolute booger. Even though it's right around the corner, that's the only one I've gotten my hands on in almost 25 years here in Texas. So I learned something else. Thought the piece would be easy. Not easy. Again, I have no idea why. That the other arrowheads, which look basically the same, are routinely available, and that one's not. 370. Boy, I'm embarrassed to say that when I started really collecting the data to put this book together, I thought the 370 in the book was a little 3-inch round because I'd at least seen a couple of those. I knew they existed. But when you look, the book tells you it's 153 millimeters. So if I dig out my Roy Moore official patch ruler, 153 millimeters, that's over 6 inches. So this is really not a pocket patch at all. This is a jacket patch. It is also the only patch in the WAB handbook where they physically list how many emblems were made. It says 50 emblems made in the handbook. I couldn't find another instance where they talked about the number made. This lodge was chartered in 1947. And if you look at the handbook, when this picture is displayed, Dwight's notes say the lodge has already been disbanded by 49. So they're around 47, 48. So 2 years. So the supposition is the boys went to the 48 NOAC with some of these patches, and they were traded there. And then shortly after that, they disappeared. Notice say that there's the R1 is 75 millimeters diameter, solid diamonds rather than hollow diamonds. They're both spectacular pieces. Among the very best in the book, I call it 99 because we know there's more than one of them. And the next page, I think, is a little more information on it since that's such an important piece. That's what a full-size one looks like. But you can see that it came at a place called the Felt Crafters in New Hampshire. And they got their claim to fame by making leather neckerchief slides and the washproof name tags that our mother used to put in our bathing suits when we were kids. They made them. And there's an ad from, I think that's coming from Boys Life, that you can buy 150 name tags from that company, put on your bathing suits. So certainly the 370J1 is the most famous thing they ever made. And what I have highlighted in yellow is, be careful. Because of the value, there are multiple pieces of that, multiple fakes. And down at the bottom, though, on the back of everyone, you can see there was a little felt crafter's tag, 18 by 34 millimeters, that David Orrell was nice enough to share with me. And if that exact tag is on the one that you turn up, I'd say it's more likely to be real, but that doesn't guarantee it. 370 R1B, not the A. Closed mouth, kind of heavy duty beaver. You can see to the right, I show an R1A that has an open mouth and not quite a rounded head. Very difficult to find that variety, but that is the exact variety in the book, R1B. Don't know why it's more difficult, but it certainly is. So 22X1B. Okay, there's an X1A, which has a standard pennant label on it from the 30s. So that design has been a long time. It's a low number, lodge number 22, so it stands to reason that they'd have some old emblems. But if I looked at what I was carrying in my cigar box, my goose had a WWW, but it had 3 periods, a period after every W. If you look at the WAB handbook, there's only 2 periods, no period after the last W. So when you narrow down what that exact issue is and turn it over, it's a standard pennant type 5 label. And I know that's hard to see in that scale, but at that time, that was the best example of that patch I had, and that is certainly a type 5 label. And this shows up in the WAB handbook. In fact, this section, you see the top of that page says superseded emblems. So even by 51 or so, Dwight knew that they'd already replaced this by something else in the lodge. So it could easily be a mid to late 40s issue, and yet we see those little gooses all over. The very prominent design from that lodge, but I probably spanned 20 or 30 years. They may still make it for all I know. Okay, this is also cool. So when Dwight put out, he had kind of like a questionnaire. Now he had help from National Council, which was a blessing for him. So he had the addresses of all the scout executives across the U.S., and he sent them a flyer. And it said stuff like, what's your lodge name? What's your lodge number? Where you're from? Can you give us of your Indian meaning, Indian name meaning? What do you mean? What history can you tell us? And can you send us a picture or an actual emblem for this book? Well, what he didn't know was some lodges sending back just a totem. He didn't know totems existed, so there aren't many shown in the book. But what he was supplied to him, he put in this one section, lodge totems. And it's interesting to note that the 2 at the bottom, which are very hard to read in this scale, but there's one there from 371, which says it's a lodge totem with a 5-pointed star made of natural material. No one's ever found one of those. And if you look at 436, there's a pin there, which I've circled in blue. That pin is described, but there have been some world-class collectors out of that lodge, and they've never found that pin. So in both those instances, 436 and 371, I believe what was supplied to Dwight was, here's what we're going to do, and they just never did it. That little neckerchief slide there, that little owl, I want to say that that's chalk, but Gene Berman owns that piece now, or one just like it, and he was nice to supply me some pictures, but that's a very rare little neckerchief slide from the New York area. Okay, there's another section in the back of the book called Lodge Without Emblems, and it lists hundreds of lodges. But there's a few, even though it's in a section that says Lodge Without Emblems, there's a few that said emblem not available to be photographed, implying there was an emblem. So these pictures are not in the handbook, but by looking at dates, Lodge 60 A1 was certainly issued before 1952 and could be the piece that he wasn't able to get a photograph of. 119X1 falls in the same category, as does 131A1 and 139X2. Those are all pre-1952. There's no guarantee that that's the piece he was talking about. What's a possibility? What was odd to me is Lodge 308 shows up in the WAB handbook as no patch available to be photographed. From talking to the people in that lodge, there was no patch for 1952. I mean, you look at that, I'm not sure when it's chartered, but certainly it's a much bigger number, Lodge 308. So I don't know how long the lodge had been around before 1952, but I'm of the belief that the WAB handbook is incorrect here, and there was no patch. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I think we're about to the end of the pictures. We're going to get the boring stuff. Okay, so I was fortunate enough in my travels to get to meet a gentleman, Robert Chalene, because unfortunately Dwight has passed. And I know you're going to post this online, Larry, so I really would like everyone to read this because there's a lot of information here, but I don't want to go through all of it. But the top picture, you can see Dwight Bichsel's grandmother on the far left. That was Grandma Ida Benson, and she had three daughters, Esther, and then you see Alice, and then you see Edna. Those are the three ladies, and the three children they're holding are their firstborn, and the one in the middle is Dwight Bichsel. So that's the oldest picture I could find of Dwight. And then if you look in the bottom left, you see there's Dwight and his cousins in Woodlawn, Chicago, early 1930s. The back is Robert Chalene. That's a gentleman who was helping me. So is that true? Yeah. Incredible to get to meet part of the family. And there's some good history about him. And please take the time to read about this when Larry posts this online. Okay, let's move on. So cover idea. So I'll show these now, but this is real education to me on just putting a cover together. It sounds so simple, but it really wasn't. Okay, let's get going. So iteration one, this is probably iteration 5 or 6 or so, but you can see I'm attached to those 5 or 6 pieces. Those are among my favorite ones. In fact, that 297 there is probably the favorite piece in my whole WAB collection. So there was an idea. I thought that looks pretty good. And then I shared it with people and they kind of went, not so good. Keep going. All right, let's keep looking. So then I came up with that one, iteration 10, keep going. I keep trying to find or come back, show that 37. Iteration 20, it was probably more iterations than that. I keep showing my 5 or 6 favorite pieces. And that is what I learned is what you have to submit to the printers. You can't give them a front page and a back page. You have to give them a front, back page, and a spline because that's how they print it. And the spline changes thickness depending how many pages you have. And the formatter who I sent this stuff kept having information one page go to the next, so they kept changing the number of pages. So just coming up with that was a real learning experience for me on how to make a cover. By the way, there is a mistake in that, which I purposely left to see if people could see it, but most people don't see it. Does anything jump out at you as wrong? Because it represents the front of all the patches and the back of all the patches.
You wouldn't see the back of that 370 right there.
There
in the
you go.
That way.
That's right. Most people just say, well, that looks like the back of all of them, but the 370 is prominently in the front on the right and should prominently be in the back on the left, but it's not. But I want to show that felt crafter sticker. How to write a book. Okay. So I know there's several people on here that have written multiple books, including Johnny, and including Mr. Al, and including Dave Minahan, and some of the rest of you also. But this was a first for me, and I must admit I made a tremendous amount of rookie mistakes and assumptions. What were my first mistake? Here's my first outline. Since I had 20 years of notes, I thought I need basically 8 weeks to compile them all in some sort of a reasonable order and put a rough draft together and send it to my expert friends, Dave Minahan, David Wida, Larry Lane, Mr. Pleasance, and say, I don't know if there's any mistakes here, but if you see one, let me know. Boy, did I get a lot of responses. Lots of mistakes. So they were very helpful, but I thought that would only take a couple of weeks. Give me a week, I can correct those areas, send it to the publisher, and in 2 to 3 weeks, I have a book signing party. That really should say 13 weeks rather than 12. But I thought this would be pretty simple. And that's a representation of someone had a book signing authority. Certainly not me. Ha! Here's what actually happened. I took all my notes and generated a rough draft in PowerPoint, which I found out none of the formatters like PowerPoint. So even though I liked it, they pretty much thumbed their nose at it. So had my friends review it, correct errors from friends, correct self-generated errors where I just wrote the wrong thing or copied the wrong note, and I found those errors I kept looking at. Patent lawyers. I had to go to patent lawyers. I didn't know how to do that. Then I start looking at the cost of getting it printed and go to patent lawyers, and I'm going, I'm gonna lose a lot of money on this book. Then I had to get a source selection list. Every image in the book that's not mine, I had to have something in writing from that person allowing me to use that image. If I'm quoting out of a book, I have to get permission. I had to write all those people. So that took a long time. And let's see, work with other people who had published lists of WAB emblems. There are people who had published images that at first told me, well, it's a protected image. I own the image, so you can't show a WAB emblem in a book. And I had to go to a lawyer to find out, well, no, that's not true. Unless it's a single copy. If I take a picture of the Grand Canyon and you took a picture of the Grand Canyon from the same view 10 years earlier, you don't own my image and I don't own yours. So I found out that as long as I own it or someone gives me permission to use it, I can put it in the book. That was a couple of months just to get that solved. Review requests from the patent lawyer, redesign the cover, redesign the cover, redesign the cover, then submit another draft to Kindle the Word, hopefully for a 1 to week turnaround. And while that was going on, apply for a copyright. Apply for an ISBN number, which I didn't know what that was. Wait 8 weeks for the formatting company to get my latest iteration and send it back to me in PDF. I don't work in PDF. So now I had to go out and buy software that allows you to work in this PDF where it's so easy to work in Word or PowerPoint. I had to learn to work in PDF to make changes because that's what the formatting companies used. Now I find out there are more errors based on new information I got while it's at the formatter, so I had to change the original in PDF, send it back, wait 6 weeks, and now it comes back and they've changed the scale of the patches. I tried to show page to page a pretty realistic scale. But what I got back, the message I told the formatter was, pretend I'm writing a coin book. What you've just done is show me that quarters are smaller than dimes. So you got to use the pictures that I gave you. You can't change the scale. And that was now weeks and weeks for them to go back and me to check that. So 12th and final review, send it back in disgust to the publisher and say, all right, you finally got the scales right. I think we've corrected most of the errors. We send it to the publisher, wait 2 to 3 weeks. And then it was at the last page. Oh, here we go. Final review. Ha! Now they've changed, different patches have changed. More changes to go back. While that's going on, I did get the copyright and ISBN numbers, so I could include those in the text. Final draft went back to them. A few more publisher corrected errors, wait another 4 to 6 weeks, discover a few more minor errors, wait another 6 weeks, got the books, canceled this book signing party, and started the distribution process. That's me with my head down. So that was more than a year, 60-something weeks to put it together. So it says my estimating was pretty poor, but I did learn a lot about it. What did I learn? The moral of the story. And I think all you guys have published books, but I know Johnny has told me, it always takes longer than they tell you. but it's never going to be perfect. So it does take longer than lawyers and formatters tell you and printers, but just ignore what they're telling you. Take all the help from folks like you because they're the backbone of our hobby. And that is true. I think I was Mr. Morley on here tonight or Topkins. I mean, they're certainly patch collecting gold on here, and they've been through this book process, so they're tremendous help. When you put something together, no matter what sort of authority you think you are, there are people who are more of an authority and absorb everything they tell you. When it gets close, print it. It's never going to be perfect. But when it gets and tells a story you want to tell, print it. I already have a one-page sheet, which I've listed all the errors that have been given me to date, and I include it with every copy of the book that I sell now. But it would have taken another year to collect all that information. So I'm glad I got it out the door. Don't write a book for financial gain. Now, I think you're probably approaching it from the wrong point of view if that's why you're doing it. I wanted to learn, and I wanted to pass on what I had learned, and I wanted to have fun. So that's what this is about. Have fun. You learn a lot. I met a lot of great people, a lot of great scouters, and I think that's the message: is the book is to help new and novice collectors and advanced collectors, but it was also for me to have fun and meet people. I met some great people during this book. This is if Larry posts this online, not necessarily for you guys, but when he posts online, if someone wants to buy a book, that's the process. I have printed 300, and I've got about 42 or 43 left. Is Rick Obermeyer on? Oh
Yeah.
my goodness, Rick Obermeyer's here. Rick, I'm sorry I didn't mention you. You're belong the same category as Mr. Al. Is that you put 20 books out? So Rick again was one of the experts I touched on to get this book, and he really should tell you the story. So if I blow it, Rick, please let me know. But in the WAB handbook, the 340X they say is like a white twill with a blue border, which no patch existed. And I think the way Rick told me was years later, someone generated that patch to fill a need that didn't exist. Never was a patch with a blue border, but there was a Pinellas area patch, which was a blue border. And in the book, I show a copy of it. Rick, can you chime in and talk about that? Because
Apparently, Dwight could not get a copy of the 340 patch, but he knew it existed. He knew it was a shield. Right about the same time, the council came out with a council patch in the same size, same design, in different colors. So I could tell he took one of the council patches and pasted over the letters that spelled out Timaquan Lodge. If you look at the picture in the original book, you can see the lettering is not stitched. The lettering is printed somehow.